Okay, good. All right, while we're taking our seats, I did a shout out last week for Pastor, and I want to say something about the music in your parish and Jonathan and all he does. It's been a pleasure to worship with all of you, with Jonathan, and if you just listen to the hymns today, they were astoundingly good, and the choir, handbells, everything goes together so well. I teach liturgy, so I'm alert to things like that. I've I've evaluated many, many liturgies over the years, and it's just pure pleasure to worship here. And I want to shout out to Cami Joe, her message this morning. I almost wanted to change my theme to Jesus always wins. That is profound. I use that sometimes. I don't use a track meet, but I use a Super Bowl. That there's no contest. Jesus always wins. And that's great. And she is consistently just wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, good. Yeah. And also, I don't know if Dwayne's here. Dwayne's been such a help to us. Dwayne, you've been so great. And Linda Nobili, we've just worked so well together. And Denise has been a pleasure to work with. And even Helen, who's such a delight. I love Helen. We're playing golf with her later today, so we're looking forward to that. It just so happens the missionary from last month and this month are two that I know. And I don't know if oh, I'm not on anymore. What did I do? It should come back. It should come back. I did that one. Oh, I got it. No, it's me. Watch. Watch the magic here. No? I guess not. There we go. There we go. You have this over here. Yeah. But I gotta, oh geez. I don't want you to see what's coming up. Hold on, hold on. Technical difficulties on the last day. There we go. Good. Yeah, I mentioned one of them was Lorna, who's right here. These are the deaconesses of Kenya. And I showed you this picture of Dennis and Lorna here. Um, the deaconess of the month, the missionary of the month, Deaconess Pamela Bailey Silva, is somebody who I've worked with in Kenya many years. And she's got quite a story here. This is from her website, and this was when I was with her, and this woman here was dying and was very ill. The first time I went to Kenya, I had a number of deaconesses with me, and we went to visit people out in the bush and in the slums, and many of them were so sick, and I mean, we could help them spiritually, but they needed some basic nursing care. And Pamela was a parish nurse. She was an excellent nurse. You can read her bio in the in the bulletin. But I asked her the next year to come, and she just brought her medical kit, and she just took care of people. And it inspired her to create a hospice, which is really what the missionary of the month is about. Create a hospice for people like this woman here. We saw so many people dying. They need hospice. My wife's parents were in hospice, and what a gift that was. Oh my gosh. And we just visited Don in hospice, and it's such a gift. I mean, hospice is such a great thing. Here are the leaders and shakers here. This man was my student. He took Luke with me, David Chuchu. Wonderful, wonderful human being. He's the guy who makes it all happen. Here you can see the construction of the building. And this woman here, Elizabeth, she was in the other photo. She was just a recent widow. She was like 30 years old when we went in 2005. And her husband died of HIV/AIDS. She didn't know how he got it, and there was a mystery then. We were there when that was just starting to hit, and they didn't know how to understand it, and we worked with them. And Pamela, she does palliative care. We did actually a seminar on that. I didn't even know what that was, and she's just excellent. She has a brochure and I'm going to hand it around. I'll leave these with you. I think Deaconess has one, but I'll just send this around. You guys can look at what she's up to, so you know what you're supporting. And I just wanted to give her a little shout out. Yes, Claudia. No, no, she goes back and forth. She's a parish nurse. She's a parish nurse, I think, in Rockland, California. Yeah. Believe it or not, we met them, her family, in the late 90s. I knew her pastor, and they flew my whole family out for a family retreat to California. And then they gave us a car, and they paid for us to go to Yosemite for 5 days. So, and we did it twice. And it was the greatest trip we've ever done. So it was a lot of fun. I wanted to just give a shout out to them. Yeah, yeah, good. Yeah. Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, there's polygamy. It's a hard thing to go there because, and even within the church, just a different culture, and they were in denial over HIV. They just would not, and we finally kind of had to sit them down and say, you guys have a problem, and you got to deal with it, and you got to bring it out in the open, or it's going to keep going. And it was in the church even. I mean, the men would stray because of polygamy and other things. It was just different kind of more fluid culture there than ours, and it was really but we learned a lot about suffering. That little book, Visitation, that I wrote, came out of my work in Kenya. So doing all those visits and seeing all the circumstances they were in, I felt like I needed to write a book, not just for them, but for us. And we use it in our calls. It's really been a good resource. Okay, anything else? All right. We briefly looked at this last week, and we're going to talk about Luke and Paul, and especially Luke, that they were in Philippi. And these two guys are very, very, very much attached. Now, the first attachment of Paul was with Barnabas here. They were the first missionary journey. And I've talked a little bit about Paul. He had a rough personality. He was rough around the edges. He was kind of a bull in a china shop. He was a tough guy, took no prisoners, but very charismatic. People intensely loyal to him because of the way he preached, the passion of his preaching. But he did have these companions who kind of made it easier for people to kind of accept Paul. One of them was Barnabas, who, he's called the son of consolation. And I think the other one was Luke. I mean, Luke is clearly a very ironic person. He's a very conciliatory person. When you read his writings, if you read them carefully, you can see what great kind of depth there is there of passion and mercy. And he and Paul, they were joined at the hip. I mean, Luke's gospel is Paul's gospel. And we think Luke was a Greek. He was probably from Thebes in Greece. That's my guess. Years ago, when Linda and I did our first tour of Greece, we had a guide. Her name was Faye. We remember her very well. PhD. She was a Greek woman, Orthodox, but she was a PhD in archaeology from the University of Minnesota. So she was an accomplished woman. And she couldn't get a job, so she was a tour director, which is a really kind of high-level job in many of these countries. Anyway, for whatever reason, she was an aficionado. She was a fan of Luke. She loved Luke like I did. And she heard that, and we started talking, and we were heading north towards Macedonia. And she asked me, do you want to stop in Thebes? Because they just translated some of Luke's poems to where he was born. So we took this bus down these narrow streets in this little city. And I got the whole bus to sign on. And it was one of the most moving things we've ever done. I think we saw the ossuary where some of his bones were. Now his bones are everywhere, but there are some, I believe, that came from Italy, and they sent them. So he's from Greece. I'll show you in a minute where it is. And he's a physician, as you know. And that's pretty kind of a slam dunk. Luke calls him that. I mean, Paul calls him that. And a physician in this day and age was was a very significant position. He would travel a lot. He was a healer, and he would have been kind of in the same category of Jesus, you know, that they made people better. And people would clamor for them, and there would be crowds that would come and visit him, and he would have been very educated. His Greek, next to Hebrews, is the best Greek in the New Testament by far. It's the hardest too. It's the most difficult to read. How did they come together? Well, we concluded last week with notice the second missionary journey, and notice the dates, 50 to 54. And I know dates can be, but remember, 30 is when Jesus rose from the dead. 70 is the destruction of Jerusalem. So you got those 40 years. So this is the halfway point. So we're halfway from the resurrection to really when it all kind of comes undone with the destruction of the temple. And in his second missionary journey, Paul starts in Antioch. And as I said, he goes home, visits mom, visits the places he went in the first missionary journey. Then he gets up here, wants to go visit Peter up in Bithynia, but the angel tells him to go to Europe. And here in Troas, it doesn't say it, yeah, it does, Troas, he gets the Macedonian call. And it is here that the we sections in Acts begin. And by the we sections, we mean that Paul is now writing in the first person plural. Paul is. Luke is writing in the first person plural, so that he and Paul now are together. And we know that. Now, one of the things that's sort of a mystery is, and this is what I want you to think about as we move forward. Luke is an evangelist, which means he writes the gospel. So he's one of the four evangelists. He's also an evangelist in that he is a missionary. And he probably was the premier missionary in Macedonia. And his parish church would have probably been Philippi, which that was the biggest and most prominent of that. And he was then also a pastor. So for about 7 or 8 years, Luke is pastoring a church in Philippi. And here's why we think that is in the third missionary journey, Paul goes the same way, except here, instead of going north, he goes across to Ephesus, spends a number of years here, and then heads home. He wants to visit his churches. He always does that. Visits Luke here in Philippi, comes back down to Ephesus, and if you remember, I said he had a lot of money with him. He was going to take a ship, but found out they were going to kill him. So he smartly goes back. This is the red arrow. And he stops and he spends the Passover. We know this from Philippians and Acts. He spends the Passover with Luke in Philippi. So they celebrate Easter there. And that's when the we sections begin again. Now, look at it's 58. This missionary journey was 54 to 58. We're at the end of it. The other one was 50. So it's 7 or 8 years. And then, of course, they head back to Jerusalem where he gets arrested. You might remember that Paul has to be in Miletus, and the Ephesian elders come to him here. It's my contention, Luke was with him, that while he's talking to the elders, Luke slips away and goes to Ephesus and has a nice chat with Mary, who is there with John. And that's where Luke got the infancy narratives. So he said, Mary, it's been given to me to write a gospel, and nobody has written the story of Jesus and his birth. So tell me the story. And then he went on to write it. This is a little dense, but it'll help you kind of get a sense of what this means. This is from that man I showed you last week, Bo Rika. He says, by using the we form, the author, Luke, apparently wanted to show that he also experienced the events in Macedonia and was explicitly included in the work of spreading the gospel. Moreover, it is striking that the very next we passage is Paul's and his companions' final departure from Philippi, and that both occurrences, though separated by considerable distance in time and events, are recorded with such meticulous detail. And there they are again. 16:10-7, Acts 20:5-6, and following. God has called us to preach the gospel, but we set sail after the days of unleavened bread. There you have the Passover. The precise descriptions in these two passages, as well as their association with Philippi, imply that the author was active in Macedonia, at least in part, during the time that Paul worked in Athens, Corinth, and Ephesus. Thus, this coincidence between the first and second we passages might well be because of the author's special association with Philippi and the Pauline Macedonian mission. The we suggests that Luke was active as a preacher in Philippi and Macedonia, although he wanted to remain anonymous in the company of Paul, Timothy, and Silas, which says something about Luke, that he didn't report this. Now, I said I was going to tell you where we think he's from, and Thebes is right in this area here, near where Delphi is. So if he is from here, then being a pastor in this peninsula here would make a lot of sense. He would have been, in a sense, in his home territory. He was probably what they called a God-fearer. I talked about them before. A Gentile hangs out around the synagogues, doesn't become a Jew because he doesn't want to be circumcised, but he's a believer. And he surely knows a great deal about the faith. Okay, I'm going the wrong way. All right, here we go. Okay, just so you can see, here's the second missionary journey, the we passages, 51, Macedonian vision, he goes to Philippi. And then the second is here in the third missionary journey, the Pascha in Philippi, Troas, Eutyches. Remember Eutyches who fell out, died, and Paul raised him from the dead. And then from Troas to Jerusalem. So what this suggests is that Luke, during this time, was a pastor. Now, why is that important? Well, we're going to see Luke is written towards the end. He's written in 58. So, again, almost 30 years after the ascension of Jesus. And by that time, the church has established a lot of congregations. People are celebrating the Lord's Supper. There's preaching that's going on everywhere. They're developing a canon, so to speak. So there are books of the Bible, New Testament, that are being distributed. And there is a kind of a churchly life that is developing. There's ministry, there are bishops and pastors and deacons and deaconesses. I mean, the church is expanding, it's growing. The Gentiles are receiving this well. And Luke is kind of right in the heart of it, in one of the most fertile fields that Paul planted. Now, one of the things you will know about Philippi, if you read it, it's probably Paul's last letter. He was in Rome. He was under house arrest. He thought he was going to be executed soon. And he writes to the Philippians, and it's really, some people call it a love letter. And if you read it carefully, you can see how much love there is between him and the Philippians. You also know that Paul had a rough go in a lot of his congregations. You're studying Galatians with me. He had trouble there, not because of what he did, but what others did there. Read 1 Corinthians. It's one big pastoral mess. I mean, we use that book for pastoral theology. We say, you think you have problems? Read 1 Corinthians. I mean, it's incest, adultery, money laundering. I mean, it was awful. I mean, they were factions, fighting, and I think I mentioned this during the Advent season. I preached on a text that talked about how it was in Ephesians text. When Paul was in Ephesus, he was absolutely under depression. We think he had depression because he could not sort out what to do in Corinth. He had gone there. He went to Corinth 4 times. And we have 2 letters, but there were 4 letters. And he kept going back and forth across the ocean to visit them. We get that by reading between the lines in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But he really wanted to sort out Corinth. And Corinth was a tough place. I mean, it was a harbor town. It was known for being, there was a word that you act like a Corinthian, which meant you act like a kind of an adulterous fool. It was crazy. But anyway, Paul is writing this last letter to a congregation that still loves him. And one of the things that he says to them, and it's really a very interesting thing, is they were by far the most generous congregation of all the congregations he founded. And I have mentioned before that one of the things Paul did, and you can read Acts this way, Acts is certainly about the mission, but it's also about the collection of funds to support the poor in Jerusalem and in Israel. And it's really, it's a book about stewardship in many ways. Diakonia, serving. And Paul was collecting that, and Philippian was by far the most generous of them all. So we're looking at a world here that has really, I mean, in some ways, with the exception of obviously Italy and Rome, which we know Peter's there, I mean, this is a huge part of the Mediterranean world that Paul evangelizes by the end of his third missionary journey. So like I always say, in 12 years, Paul essentially evangelized the entire Mediterranean with the exception of Italy, which, as I said, was already filled with pastors. One of the great moments, I think, in salvation history, at least for me, is what happens when Paul is under house arrest in this place called Caesarea Maritima, and Luke and Mark come to him. And just to help you orient where you are here, Caesarea is right here, as you can see. So it's right in it's in Palestine, and it's called Caesarea because there were wonderful Roman forums here. In fact, here is probably what it looked like at the time of Paul. Nobody knows how they did this harbor. This was Herod the Great who did this, and it was a marvel. There was a hippodrome right here. This is where Paul was tried before Herod Agrippa the second. You can see the Stoa, the Maxima, the Minima. These are the marketplaces, big market town. You know, the walls and then all the fields. I mean, this was an incredible place. And this is where Paul was for 2 years. Just going back to the map, remember, he's arrested in Jerusalem. He appeals to Caesar. So they take him to the closest place, which was Caesarea. He's there for 2 years while they're waiting what to do with him. And finally, they decide to send him to Rome. So he then makes his way to Rome. Just to kind of reorient you with these periods of evangelization, I showed you these a couple weeks ago. But what we're in is the end of this third period, the Gentile Pauline mission. And this is where James is the brother of Jesus, is the Bishop of Jerusalem. And right after that, during this period of time, the Gospels of Mark and Luke are written. Or to be even more precise, okay, here you have it. He's arrested in 58, sent right to Caesarea. And then it's during this time that Mark writes Peter's Gospel and Luke writes Paul's Gospel. And then his journey to Rome. You can see the Bishop of Jerusalem, this is James, is martyred here. Paul is in Rome for a while, and we think he might have gone to Spain, and then both of them are martyred here in 64, 65. And you know, we usually think of their martyrdom, these two great apostles, the ones Acts 1 to 12, Acts 13 to 28, Peter and Paul. Their martyrdom was essentially the end of the apostolic era. So all 12 had probably been martyred by then, and even the 70 were probably gone. The only exception, of course, is the evangelist St. John, who lived to be almost, well, he lived into the 90s, maybe even 100. And then, of course, the catastrophic destruction of the temple. Some people say it was, next to the cross, the most violent moment in the history of the world. The temple, you should read Josephus on what happened when the temple was destroyed. It was horrific. Okay. Yes. Question. I didn't see you. You're so close here. can't see your hand. Yeah. What's up?
One is how many gospels was at this time, and was the criteria to take them in the canon? Was it any problem with the Gnostics at this time or not?
Um, great question. How many gospels were at this time? Were they brought into the canon at this time? And were there any Gnostics? Gnostics was a heretical sect. Uh, that was there might have been that too, but it believed that first of all, it didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, but it believed that you came to know God through some sort of kind of out of body experience or sensual experience or some sort of psychological experience, spiritual experience, and they were very much against the Christian church. And they were present. John's gospel addresses them. Certainly, Paul is aware of them and addresses them. I don't know that the synoptic gospels were that aware or addressing the Gnostic, movement. But there are many people today who write about the Christian church today or about the world today, and we live in a Gnostic culture. And what Gnosticism does is it separates the body from the soul. And so it basically says that the body is bad and it's kind of detached and the soul is good. And the whole issue that we have today with transgenderism, homosexuality, the dissolution of marriage, it's all Gnosticism that is causing this to happen. The new Gnosticism. There's a book written about that, and it's worth your while. So there were 3 Gospels written. Matthew was early. He was written in the 40s. And now here you can see that these 2 are written here. Matthew was immediately accepted because he was one of the 12. And it was for the Jewish mission. If you go back here, you can see that when you have a Jewish mission, you have a Jewish gospel. When you have a Gentile mission, you have gospels that are geared towards the Gentiles. Just makes sense. It's kind of just common sense. You're appealing to Jews, you have a Jewish gospel. You're appealing to Gentiles, you have a gospel that is more given to help Gentiles understand this. I want to get into Luke. We're going to look at the prologue. And in order to look at the prologue, we have to deal with this guy Theophilus, because Luke dedicates his gospel and the book of Acts to Theophilus. Now, translated in the Greek, this means like Philadelphia, friend or lover of God. Phileo is a way of one of the 3 words for love. So it could just be this is addressed to a generic lover of God. For all of you who love God, this gospel is dedicated to you. There's a problem with that in this sense, that there is no evidence in all of the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century that anybody dedicated a gospel to somebody who was not a real person. So it really kind of falls down. It would be a really unique situation. Theophilus was a very popular name, and when you dedicated a book to someone, it was probably because that person is paying the bill. Okay? Now, I don't know how they did this, but scholars estimate that the cost for Luke to write his gospel and have it distributed would have been in the equivalent of today of about $25,000 to $30,000, which was an outrageously enormous sum at that time. And for somebody to underwrite a gospel, and then the book of Acts, he's worthy of a dedication. And so they're called a literary patron. So you would dedicate a book to a literary patron. Now, this is my theory, that Theophilus is a Greek who is from Philippi. Okay, so he has Luke as his pastor. And I think that he is a catechumen, which means he is a hearer of the word who is going towards baptism. And Luke is catechizing him through Matthew's gospel. And I'm sure as they're doing this, they're talking back and forth. This is great, but what is a synagogue? You know, what is the temple? What are the Sabbath laws? What are the purity laws? You know, why are priests and Sadducees? Who are these people? You know, I'm a Greek from Philippi. I have no idea who these people are. And Luke's having to explain it all. You know, now Matthew doesn't have to explain it because it's written to Jews. They know all this stuff. But I think Theophilus and Luke and Paul put their heads together and said, we need a gospel that explains to Gentiles all these Jewish things, that help us understand that in order to understand Jesus, the first thing you got to understand about them is that he's a Jew, that he worshiped like a Jew, he ate like a Jew, he kept the Jewish laws, and that the Jewish kind of way of worship, the way of life, the whole manner of the style of being Jewish, the way in which they interpreted Scripture, you need to understand this in order to understand Jesus. And that's one of the things that I think you can see in Luke's Gospel. When we study it together next year, you're going to see how that comes out again and again and again. He's got the only synagogue liturgy in the first 3 centuries. So we know what the synagogue liturgy looks like because of Luke. He's got the longest Passover account. I mean, I could go on and on and on. He starts in the temple, ends in the temple. I mean, it's just astounding. So we think that this guy, and this is a picture supposedly of Theophilus, and Luke, they got together. You know, Luke's the bull, sacrifice, you know, and the iconographer. We talked about that earlier. They got together, and he underwrites it, he pays for it, and Luke writes it. Now, here is his prologue. And there's no other prologue like this, at least among the synoptics. You know, John has a prologue, but it's completely different. It's more of a poetic type of prologue. But this is it's a remarkable piece of writing. Greeks at the time of the first century, the time of Jesus, they were great admirers of fine writing. They loved writing. They loved listening to words. And everything was rhetorical, rhetoric. And if they were to read something or hear something, they would completely dismiss it if it was common Greek, called Koine Greek. They wanted this Hellenistic, highfalutin Greek, you know, classical Greek is what we call it today. And Luke obliges them. There are scholars who say these verses, these 4 verses that start Luke, may be the best classical Greek written in the first century. Like I like to say, Luke is strutting his stuff here. And he would have immediately pulled in all the Greeks, because when they read this, they would go, wow, this guy can write. I'm in a book club with my high school classmates, and we read books all the time, and I had to recommend a book for the last one, and I recommended a book by Tobias Wolff. Write it down, everybody. Buy it and read it. Old school. It's about prep school. It's a great book. But the writing in that, I mean, I just read it again. It's probably the 3rd or 4th time I've read it. I just read it again, and I've never been happier just listening to his language. It's beautiful, beautiful writing. And be prepared for the end. I won't give it away. None of my classmates knew what the ending was about. I had to enlighten them. But it's a biblical ending. And it is a powerful book. Anyway, I love reading great writing. And it's just a pleasure. And so did the Greeks. What's interesting, and we'll see this when we get together again in the fall, starting in verse 5, when he starts telling the Old Testament story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, Zechariah in the temple, Luke goes not only into an old Greek or a common Greek like Koine Greek, the Greek that the Greeks spoke on the street. He goes back to what was called Septuagintal Greek. Septuagint, or the 70 who translated the Old Testament into Greek. And it's old Greek. It's like if we were to read the Living Bible today, or let's use a better one. If we were to read like what is the one that the Jerusalem Bible, okay? That's kind of a Catholic Bible. Very well written, but very contemporary. And then it would switch into not just King James Greek, but King James before it was cleaned up, in the 20th century. I mean, old Elizabethan language. We would be alerted right away. And what Luke is doing is he's saying, hey, I can write great Greek, but now I'm going to tell you a story that sounds like the Old Testament, that goes back to the Old Testament. Again, the Greeks would have been impressed with this, that he had this ability to launch into this Greek. And they loved the fact that Christians and Jews had this great history that goes all the way back to the beginning of time, to Adam and Eve, this great history. And so they would have been impressed. This is the kind of the Old Testament continued. And then when he starts chapter 3, Luke, he goes into the Greek of the day, the common Greek that everybody could understand. So he's a master, is what I'm saying. I always evaluate, this is all one sentence. It's called a periodic sentence because it only has one period. And here's the main verb. It seemed good to me also to compose systematically. That's what he wants to do. It seemed good to me also to compose a systematic narrative. But everything kind of leads to that. And he tells us an incredible amount of information about the writing of a gospel and kind of the context of what it was like in 58 when he wrote this. He starts by saying, since many have endeavored, so notice many, to reproduce a narrative. Now, Luke is claiming here he's not the first gospel. Others have done this before. There are probably traditions. There's obviously Matthew's gospel, maybe Mark, I don't know. But others have endeavored to do this. And notice what he calls his book. He calls it a narrative, or if we wanted to be more common, a story. Now remember, stories are not fictional. I'm going to tell you a story about my life. I'm not going to make it up. I'm going to tell you the true story of my life. Sometimes we have to put true story, but a narrative is a story. And here, right away, what Luke is telling us is that his gospel is a literary work. We're supposed to look at it as a narrative that is worthy of interpretation. Now, does anybody know what Matthew calls his gospel? Does anybody know that? He calls it a biblos, a Bible. That's what he calls it, a Bible. And that's what they would have called the Old Testament. That would have immediately alerted his Jewish audience, like, what? Is he writing scripture? And he says it. And what does Mark call his gospel? He is the one who coined the word gospel. He said, I'm going to write you a gospel. That's how we got the word gospel for the 4 gospels. But he calls it a narrative. And it is concerning, notice the events. We would insert here historical events. These are things that happened. And they have come to fulfillment among us. Notice that fulfillment means these events were promised before in the Old Testament. And now they have reached their goal. They've come to an end. And I know this may not seem like much, but notice he uses the word us. That's the church. He's talking about how these events have reached their goal here in this church that I am writing for. Then he says, I'm going real fast here because I only have 10 minutes. Just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and became ministers of the word. Now, they're the same group. And this is an important little distinction here. This will show you how to interpret the scriptures, at least the New Testament. You have Jesus here before the cross, and you've got the eyewitnesses. Okay? The 12, the 70, and all the others. And then over here, after the cross, after Pentecost, they become ministers of the word. Same group. Okay? Now, these eyewitnesses, when they listen to Jesus' teaching, when they're with Jesus, and I'll show you this next year, they are absolutely clueless. They have no idea really what he's talking about. They're confused. They're finding it difficult to comprehend his teaching. And it's really they're really struggling to understand what he's about. Now they hear it and they obviously end up recording it, but their eyes are hidden from its meaning. And why? Because they don't know the end of the story. They don't understand because they don't know what's going to happen on the cross, and especially the resurrection. The resurrection is the great enlightenment. And Jesus tells them that. You're not going to understand this till I rise from the dead. So don't go have a beer. Don't worry about it. It's not going to happen for you. Okay? The resurrection. They don't know the end of the story. However, these people over here, okay, the ones who become ministers of the word, same group, they totally get it. One, they know the resurrection. Two, they got the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And now they're reading back through these events to the words of Jesus, and all of a sudden they're going, now I know what he was talking about. Now I get it. Okay? And that's what Luke is saying here. Those who were eyewitnesses, notice from the beginning. And the beginning is the baptism of John the Baptist. That would be considered the beginning. Okay? And became ministers of the word. And this is a very important little statement here. They delivered these traditions. That's how I translate it here. To us, the church. Now, this word for tradition is a very important word in the scriptures. Luke loves this word. And it really means to deliver something. This morning, during the Lord's Supper, when Pastor says, on the night in which he was betrayed, that's this word. Tradition. The night in which he was delivered. The passion of Jesus is this word that we translate tradition. Tradition is not a bad word. The first line of the tradition is the Bible. And what tradition does, the scriptures, is it hands over. That's another way of putting it. It hands over the faith. Now, just to show you how clever Paul is, he uses the double meaning of this in the same verse, when he talks about the Lord's Supper. Paul says, I received from the Lord, it's a different word, so I received this from the Lord, what I now hand over to you. Tradition, I'm handing down the faith. That on the night in which Jesus was handed over, same word. Brilliant. And what I would say, and I think it's, past doctrinal review, so it must be true. The tradition is the passion. That's the tradition. The tradition, what is handed over is the passion. So these are delivered over. So all of this seemed good. Look, notice how he uses the first person. To me, Luke. And then he goes back, he interrupts himself. He said, and know this, I investigated from the beginning. Notice they're from the beginning. So he went every tradition carefully. So every written or oral tradition very carefully. And this may not be a strong enough word, but this is the word where I think we would get the notion of inspiration and inerrancy. Okay? He did it in such a way, with such care, that everything he hands down is exactly what is to be handed down. Inerrancy. The in is important. And I love this. He composed it systematically. Now, what does that mean? He has an order. It means he composed it in an order. Is it a chronological order? Yes. Although sometimes Luke isn't always chronological. I'll point that out to you. I think, my opinion, the order in which he composed it was so that it could be preached. So it's a preaching order. It's an order so that when somebody has this in a church and they start reading this, they can read it and then preach on it. Read it and preach on it. And what does preaching do? Faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the word of Christ. It converts people. So it's a performative word. this narrative again. Okay, for your benefit, most excellent Theophilus, there he is. And now this is in many ways the most important thing, and I'm going to talk real fast, like in that commercial. There you can talk really fast so I can get through this really, okay. In order that, notice, this is the purpose, that you might come to recognize, literally that means know, with complete assurance, the certainty. That's a big word. It's the last one in the Greek concerning the words, and this is exactly what it says, by which you have been catechized, instructed. Now, this is a very, come on. It won't move. Oh boy. There we go. In order that you may come to know, this is, you talked about the Gnostics. Know is, in Luke, is a synonym for faith, to know someone. And you know how he uses it? He uses it in the way in which Genesis uses it. You know, that a man and woman know one another, that intimacy, that communion with flesh. That's the kind of knowing that faith is. Faith is a communion with the flesh of Jesus. So to know Jesus is to have this communion with him. And this notion of certainty, I wrote an entire paper on this. It can mean truth, reliability, assurance. I like certainty of faith. And here, this will be my final point, and it really is sort of the end. One of the things, this is where you can see what a brilliant guy Luke is. This word for knowing here is, it has a prefix on it. There's a word for know, and then there's a word for kind of know in a deeper way that has a prefix on it, epignosko instead of gnosko, epignosko. That word is only used twice in Luke. It's used here in 1:4, and the next time it's used, here, I'll go ahead here. It's used here at the Emmaus story. I think this is the climax of Luke's gospel. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And that is in the breaking of the bread. So how do you know Jesus? How do you commune with him? How do you have this fleshly union with him? It is in the Lord's Supper. It is in the breaking of the bread. And this is one of the reasons why many people think that Luke is the pastoral gospel, because he has Christ crucified. He has more on preaching. We're going to see that. He has more on baptism, and he has more on the Lord's Supper than any of the other gospels. And that is my final word to you until next year. It's been a delight for me. As you can see, I love teaching. It's been great. I'm going to go back and teach an entire course on Luke and Mark this spring. It's going to be so much fun. And I'm teaching Galatians, everybody. So my two main things. And I wish you well. Linda and I can't tell you what an absolute joy and delight it's been. It's really been wonderful. And I thank you all. And I especially thank your pastor. I wouldn't be here. I've said that if it wasn't for him. He is the one who's made this possible. And it's such pleasure. We work so well together. It's really, we haven't had a fight yet. Okay, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Amen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Are you coming to turn me off? Yeah, you better turn me off. Okay, good. We got church.